Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Silver Swan, In Search of Doris Duke, by Sallie Bingham, narrated by Donna Postel. The idea of old money, so dear to the hearts of the old rich, is a fiction, a sentimental fiction, not even a legal one. Nelson W. Aldrich, Jr., Old Money, The Mythology of America's Upper Class. By any definition, woman is an outsider. A difficult notion genuinely to digest, as woman occupies one half of the race, constitutes an entire sexual category, cuts across all cultures, classes, and conditions, and often occupies positions of honor within those very circumstances in which total rule is exercised, it nevertheless is true. Vivian Gornick and Barbara K. Moran, Women in Sexist Society, Studies in Power and Powerlessness. I must become a fabulous opera, and not the arena of the known. Hélène Cixous, The Character of Character. Beauty, its creation and enjoyment, is my life's goal. Doris Duke. Preface. In the late summer of 1958, I was a shy, nearly silent 21-year-old, awkwardly adjusting to my honeymoon with my young husband, when he took me to a formal luncheon in a grand apartment in Paris. His father moved in that world. I had no idea what to expect. Raised in privilege, but in Kentucky, I spoke only a little French, and as a beginning writer had little confidence. Although my mother had worked hard to teach me how to conduct myself at adult occasions, a mixture of reticence and inchoate rebellion had caused me to resist learning her useful lessons, beyond shaking hands and murmuring a few polite inanities. Yet there I was, sitting at a long dining-room table, with 10 or 12 dark-suited French gentlemen on either side. The lunch consisted of 4 courses, passed by silent waiters in livery. My shyness made me afraid of choking, and I hardly dared touch a drop of the 3 kinds of wine. Embroidered linen napkins and crystal and silver glinting in the dim Paris sunlight did nothing to make me feel at home. And there was no master of the house sitting at the other end of the table. Instead, very far from me, reigned a distinguished presence. A woman of a certain age, filled with power, authority, and dignity such as I had never encountered. What she wore, or even what she looked like or said, escaped my attention. I was overwhelmed, fascinated, and frightened by her sheer presence. I don't believe we exchanged a single word. Later, my new husband told me that our hostess was Doris Duke, an heiress and a philanthropist. Decades later, I visited Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, endowed and named by Doris Duke's father after his family, and a recipient of her generosity. With Jean O'Barr, distinguished professor and founder of Duke's Women's Studies Department, I was setting up the Sallie Bingham Archive for Women's History and Culture, which now, nearly 30 years later, holds an ever-growing collection of the papers of women writers, artists, and feminist activists, as well as records of the institutions they founded. I was staying at the very comfortable, very southern Washington Duke Inn, named for Doris Duke's grandfather, near the edge of the west campus of the university. Every day as I walked to the elevators, I passed a row of impressive black busts on pedestals, commemorating 3 generations of Dukes: Doris's father, grandfather, uncle, and nephew. But where was Doris? Her exotic, heart-shaped face, her sly smile and sideways glances had appeared all over the world in news stories and fashion shots, but none of these were framed and hung at the inn. I searched in vain for a bust, a portrait, or even a photograph, both at the inn and on the campus. I found nothing. Eventually, I was led to a small photograph in the corner of a garden center she had endowed. Whenever I find a trace of a woman whose story has been expunged, I want to know what caused the omission. What characteristics of the vanished woman resulted in her banishment from history? I was mystified. Doris Duke is by far the best-known member of her family. Even today, more than 2 decades after her death, her name usually evokes a look of recognition, whereas her grandfather, father, and uncles, despite their accomplishments, have vanished into virtual obscurity. Did Doris's absence from the family portrait gallery reflect her well-known reticence? Her at times distant relationship with the university? Had the rumors that plagued her from childhood obscured her accomplishments? Or had the mere fact of her independence, her choice of an unconventional way of life, been responsible for her excision? Dubbed the richest girl in the world when she inherited, at 13, the hydroelectric and tobacco fortune of her father, James Buchanan Duke, Doris was pursued, nationally and internationally, by the tabloids all her life. It was not what she wanted. Was this unwelcome attention the cause of her exclusion? I set out to discover the answer, probing the recesses of the vast archive Doris Duke left to the Rubenstein Library at Duke. Now, 8 years later, I have discovered many more mysteries and exclusions, and at the center of it all, the paradox of a woman about whom everything seems to be known, but who retains a certain mystery. Her life a template for that extraordinary phenomenon, the new woman. Just 2 years before Doris Duke's birth, on November 22nd, 1912, Virginia Woolf daringly claimed, "On or about December 1910, human character changed." As an example, Woolf describes her iconic Mrs. Brown as capable of appearing in any place, wearing any dress, saying anything and doing heaven knows what. But the things she says, and the things she does, and her eyes and her nose, and her speech and her silence, have an overwhelming fascination. For she is, of course, the spirit we live by, life itself. In short, the new woman, complex, challenging, and, like Doris Duke, a rule unto herself. Prologue. Wearing her signature 2-piece bathing suit, elastic, sturdy, designed for serious swimming, Doris Duke climbs down the steep bluff below Rough Point, her mansion on the coast at Newport, Rhode Island, and plunges into the ocean. For a moment she disappears beneath the waves, and the gardener, sent by her staff, starts from behind his tree. He is hiding because Doris would be furious if she knew he was waiting there, armed with a coil of rope, in case she needs rescue. She does not. She surfaces, swimming strongly toward the calmer water outside of the cove. She breaststrokes out, then turns on her back to float, staying so long in the cold water her fingers shrivel and her lips turn blue, just as when, decades earlier, she swam all morning with her best friend, Aletta Morris, at nearby Bailey's Beach. Floating, she glimpses her camels, Princess and Baby, lazing on the lawn in front of her house, wearing the pink harnesses she bought for them from Schiaparelli in Paris. Later, she'll twine pink hibiscus from her garden into their manes. In spite of having shrunk a bit with age from her commanding height of 6'1", Doris is long and lean in the water. In Hawaii, she still occasionally wears her wetsuit and surfs off Diamond Head, one of the first non-native women to brave those waves. But her time in the water is up. Guests are coming for lunch. She sidestrokes into the cove, clambers out, and climbs up the bluff. The gardener hurriedly retreats before she sees him. Crossing the lawn, she stops to stroke Baby's furry neck. She has never regretted her purchase of a Boeing 737-300 aircraft to transport the 2 camels from J.C. Schultz's game farm in Catskill, New York. Along with her dogs, the camels are her greatest comfort. In her second-floor bedroom, she dresses in one of her gauzy orange caftans, then turns on the radio to check the weather. If an Atlantic storm is brewing, she'll give orders to have the furniture moved out of the ground-floor solarium and straw spread so that Baby and Princess can take shelter there. Her father, James Buchanan Duke, would have understood. They both loved the horses, the pony Prince, and the dogs that had lived during Doris's childhood at Duke Farms in Somerville, New Jersey. Now, when she visits the farm, she houses her dogs right next to her bedroom, on a fenced porch with a door so they can come in to visit her. They sometimes climb up on the bed beside her when she is eating her breakfast off a tray. Her father would have understood that, too, but he had died years earlier, in 1925, when Doris was a girl of not quite 13. He had never had a chance to see his beloved only daughter swimming out to sea at Rough Point or battling the waves off Diamond Head. Battling ocean waves in the Atlantic and the Pacific led Doris to other adventures, not least her involvement in World War II. 1. September 1944. In Europe, the war was coming to an end. The Allies had invaded Normandy, and the occupying German army had surrendered Paris. In New York, Doris Duke was fretting that she was missing the experience of her generation. This was the time to go, especially now that her divorce from her first husband, Jimmy Cromwell, was finalized. She had initiated proceedings in 1943 on grounds of extreme cruelty. Late in September, Doris would receive official permission to go to Cairo. Her U.S. passport, however, did not authorize her to visit other countries except ones she might have to pass through on her way to Egypt. Here begins Doris's struggle with the State Department. Since Egypt was now a backwater in the war, she wanted instead to get to a country closer to the fighting in order to write dispatches of consequence for the international news services. But the State Department had other ideas, perhaps in an attempt to disguise Doris's dual role as minor undercover agent for the OSS and war correspondent. She was aware that nothing she could write from or about Egypt would attract the level of attention of dispatches from the war zone. Her movements in this period are difficult to trace, since she felt empowered to go wherever she wanted, with or without an authorizing passport and visa. She wanted to be able to travel around Europe as freely as she had moved with her parents in the years before the war. Her privilege, at this point in her life, gave her the illusion that she could always go her own way. Doris's difficulties were compounded by the notoriety of her divorce. She had spent 6 months in Reno, Nevada, establishing residency in the only state where it was possible to obtain a quick divorce. Her decree was issued on December 21, 1943, but then Jimmy had contested it, questioning the legitimacy of her residence in Nevada. The final decree would not be issued until 1948, but Doris would not wait. She was already packing for Cairo. Into her sunny bedroom, on the second floor of the great white limestone mansion at the corner of 78th Street and 5th Avenue in Manhattan that was built by her father, the porter and his mate hauled 2 Louis Vuitton steamer trunks. On the right side of each trunk was a capacious cupboard with wooden hangers, covered by a blue silk curtain. On the left, 6 drawers, each equipped with metal pulls. Her mother's scent, Guerlain's 1912 L'Heure Bleue, wafted out as she opened the top drawer. Doris selected the various outfits she would need. For England, where Captain Alec Cunningham Reed might or might not be waiting. For the continent, as she had learned to call Europe on trips with her parents. And for Egypt. Into the trunk went bathing suits for the Mediterranean, golf outfits for servicemen's clubs and grand hotels, tennis dresses and rackets for mixed doubles, and proper suits for the work she hoped for as a foreign correspondent. Doris knew what she wanted, if not necessarily how she would achieve it. In the first trunk, on the hanging side, she arranged size 16 pre-war Paquion suits, size 10 by American standards, and an assortment of evening gowns. She based her choices on her past work. Recently, she had been running a relief station in New York Harbor for the United Seamen's Service, throwing parties with plenty of food and pretty girls for merchant seamen on leave. A lifetime later, her New York Times obituary, October 3, 1993, reported that she had said of that period, "I couldn't live with myself if I didn't do something real to help with this war. This may sound funny, but I honestly believe I'm happier now than I've ever been. I'm doing something worthwhile, earning the right to be friends with a lot of swell, interesting people. I've discovered, I guess, that it's fun to work." For her training, Doris had been dispatched in April 1944 for 1 month to the United Seamen's Service in New Orleans. On May 29, 1944, J. Riley Marcus, business manager at the Merchant Marine Relief Center, wrote to his opposite number at the Rest Center in Oyster Bay, New York, that Doris Duke had arrived in an atmosphere that was colored, inevitably, by expectations the men might have formed from reading news stories about her. Yet Marcus wrote, with seeming surprise, that these expectations were dispelled almost at once by Doris's calm, even-handed treatment of everyone she met. She accepted all of the men as worthy of whatever help she could provide. Some of the merchant mariners were African Americans, never a problem for Doris, who had loved her father's African American valet and felt an affinity with people of color. She was to be paid $1 a year and to serve until the end of the war. A check for her first $1 was enclosed in Marcus's letter. Her job was not frivolous. Merchant ships carrying essential supplies to England were vulnerable to submarine and air attack. They were lightly armed, if at all, and even in convoys were subject to sinking by the Axis powers. Rest and recreation for the sailors between these harrowing voyages were essential. Still, Doris had her sights on journalistic work. It had seemed that Doris's break had come much earlier, in September 1942, when the FBI head, J. Edgar Hoover, wrote to thank her for her intelligence work and raised the possibility of a dual assignment abroad, foreign correspondent and minor operative for the OSS. This explains her posting to Egypt, which was at this point in the war a nest of spies. But red tape, and her lack of credentials, had kept Doris in the United States for 2 more years. Admittedly, she had no training or background as a journalist, and in fact she hardly wrote at all. But that, for Doris, was no impediment. She could always learn. One of the very rare interviews with Doris, conducted by her International News Service boss, Mike Chinigo, on January 30, 1945, was printed in Stars and Stripes, a daily publication for United States forces stationed in Europe. An accompanying photograph of Doris predictably identifies her as the world's richest girl. In the interview, she spoke fondly of the service, referring to herself several times as a dangerous woman, like screen stars of the period such as Hedy Lamarr, whose allure was enhanced by her roguishness. This led Chinigo to conclude that the posting to Cairo was the only possibility for Doris. Her face was not so familiar there that she would have difficulty maintaining dual roles. Chinigo mentions that, in Alexandria, Egypt, Doris had repainted and redecorated the American Seamen's Club and arranged its first dance. Asked if the subject of her fortune ever came up at the club, she said it never had. Chinigo added that she was a tall blonde who seemed friendly and approachable. When he apologized for asking her age, she replied, without hesitation, that she was 32. After one of the officers attending the interview said that she was 3 years his junior, she got up, shook his hand, and congratulated him on being even older than she was. About 6 months later, on June 23, 1945, Mike Chinigo again interviewed her, this time for an article called Doris Duke, Learning How to Be a Reporter. When Chinigo asked her why she wanted to be a reporter, she replied that she felt compelled to do something worthwhile with her life. She added that her friend, the writer Claire Booth Luce, had sparked the idea when she was visiting Doris in Hawaii back in 1941. Doris told Chinigo that she had been preparing for the job by studying and then rewriting news stories. She said she understood that she might not be taken seriously by editors, since she had no previous experience as a reporter. She knew she would have to establish herself as a responsible professional by proving that she could observe accurately and write persuasively. She went on to say that, during this unorthodox apprenticeship, she had begun to appreciate how useful newspaper reporting could be when stories about important events were written responsibly. This work might satisfy her drive to achieve something independent of her family and her fortune, as well as introduce her to a great variety of people. She hoped to write news stories that would appeal to a mass audience, a large swath of the population she would never have encountered in her post-debutante life in New York. She had already learned how difficult it was for editors to take their minds off her celebrity and attend to her interest in her work, but she believed she could cut through their fascination with her by presenting herself as a hard-working reporter. Doris's reporting put to rest one myth, that she could not write, which has been used as an attempt to explain the small number of her letters in her archive. For that, there is a more compelling explanation. From an early age, Doris feared the loss of privacy that would result if unfriendly eyes read her correspondence. This apprehension severely curtailed her letter writing. Anyhow, she explained, most of the letters she received answered themselves over time. After the war, when she began to refuse almost all interviews, Doris was imitating her father's determination to shield himself from scrutiny in an age of gossip columnists and scandal sheets. She would never again feel comfortable enough with an interviewer to talk as frankly as she had with Mike Chinigo. 2. Doris's war reporting had been discredited in other accounts as simply a desperate attempt to reunite in England with Captain Alec Cunningham Reid, the British MP whom she had met in the United States in 1937. Alec did not lack for dash. In 1927, he had been dubbed England's handsomest man when he married the wealthy Honorable Ruth Mary Clarice Ashley, with whom he had 2 sons. During their divorce proceedings in 1940, Alec sued his wife for £400,000. He was known in Britain as the unconventional MP, the author of a controversial and outspoken book about the Second World War, Blame the Old Gang. He was admired as a World War I flying ace, but criticized for blaming the Conservative Party for causing World War II, although he had served as a Conservative Party member in the House of Commons for 13 years. On July 28, 1943, he came to blows with another Conservative MP, Oliver Locker-Lamson, who accused Alec of fleeing London during the Blitz for the United States and Doris Duke. Both men later apologized to the House, but the incident made all the London papers and was mentioned in Jimmy Cromwell's divorce from Doris as evidence of her adultery. When Alec heard that Doris was posted to Cairo and not permitted by the State Department to travel to London, he wrote that the news was a body blow. But in the same undated letter, Alec also wrote that he accepted rumors that she was about to be married again because they were such good friends that marriage was clearly out of the question. Apparently, in lieu of a marriage contract, Doris had offered him devoted comradeship. In a letter in which he referred to himself as Wirtz, Doris's nickname for him, he wrote that he had been living in a cuckoo dreamland, revealing that he had promised to marry a certain English girl by 1944. By then, he expected that Doris would give them her blessing. His fiancée was poor, but charming and sensible, and according to Alec, apparently accepted quite happily that Doris had been the greatest thing in his life. If she had not, he continued, he would have walked out on her. He told Doris he felt that his news would come as a relief to her. Alec and Doris had shared some good times in the early days of their relationship, including an interlude when Doris taught him to crisp bacon by draining it on brown paper. They had especially enjoyed a trip down the Seine. A series of small black-and-white decal-edged photos showed Doris smiling broadly as she sits on deck behind Alec. In another photo, Michael, his eldest son, leans affectionately against his father's shoulder. Snapshots from their 1945 tour of Italy contain familiar views of cathedrals. Doris, in flats, stands shoulder to shoulder with Alec, as though to prove that they are the same height, a recurring issue in all her photos with men. In an earlier undated letter to his dearest Borgia, his nickname for Doris, Alec regretted that he hadn't seen her since they rode bicycles together before the war. He remembered saying that Doris was the only person he had ever loved. He claimed to be flabbergasted by Doris's reaction, stating that he would always remember something whizzing at him through the air after his proposal. The nickname he used for Doris linked her to the infamous Borgias, the Italian and Spanish family that produced 2 popes and was accused of many crimes. He was probably alluding specifically to the notorious Lucrezia Borgia, whose love letters to Pietro Bembo had been much admired by Lord Byron. At the bottom of his letter, Doris penciled, "Sorry, Wirtz, I got you wrong. Let's meet soon. Love and kisses, Borgia." But the war and Alex's next marriage intervened. Alec compared the loss of their relationship to the blotting out of pages from a copybook. He denied knowing what crime he had committed, and surmised that it must have been a simple misunderstanding. He continued to write her, and at one point asked her to pay $27 to a shipyard where Doris had bought a boat she and Alec had christened the Pious Puffin. Alec claimed the shipyard was threatening to have a process server visit Doris, and that interesting particulars would be revealed to the press, with the possibility of a trial and more publicity. He wanted to visit her to explain the situation. Doris recognized a threat when she saw one, and cabled Alec, "Your arrival very inconvenient for me at present time. Fail to understand why discussing with me is necessary concerning additional contracts made by you and which are therefore up to you to settle." Alec had overplayed his hand. In another undated letter, Alec wrote Doris that he fought back steadily against insinuations that his trip to the United States to arrange safe conditions for British children to escape the Blitz was a pleasure jaunt to visit Doris. After all, he had returned to London in October 1940, at the height of the German bombardment. During the Blitz, when he sent his boys to the United States, Doris became their unofficial guardian. She had already spent time with them and their father in Hawaii and California, Switzerland and France, providing not only splendid vacations, but also the companionship they craved. But now that Doris was overseas, the boys, 12 and 10 years old, were put in the care of a Mrs. Wisner. After an undefined act of disobedience, they were shipped off to the elite Lawrenceville School, near Trenton, New Jersey, which happened to have been Jimmy Cromwell's alma mater. Between 1932 and 1937, the older boy, Michael, became devoted to Doris, whom he called Darling Lihi, a reference to the nickname Doris had acquired in Hawaii. In fact, Michael wrote to Doris more often than he did to his father in London, causing Alec to complain bitterly of neglect. On July 6, 1943, Alec wrote a friend that he had tried to arrange for Michael to write to Doris one week and to him the next, acknowledging that the boys owed much to Doris, and referring to her as invaluable and the most wonderful friend imaginable. They also owed a great deal to Marian Pascal, Doris's personal assistant, who oversaw the boys' day-to-day lives when they were not at school. Alec begged Doris in a cable to tell his sons that he was remarrying. He couldn't face telling them himself. Covering for Doris, Marian Pascal protested in a return cable that it was crucial that Alec discuss his decision with his sons. Alec refused, and it fell to Marian to tell the boys. Later, Michael wrote to Doris that he and Marian had been floored by his father's marriage to a person they had never met. He continued that they did not know whom or if Alec had actually married, since there were no announcements in the papers and the only information they had was a strange-sounding cable.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?